The Dawnbreakers, Neville's narrative, recorded for the handicapped, tape 13. The memory of that night still lingers in the minds of those who experienced its awe and terror. I have heard several eyewitnesses express in glowing terms the contrast between the tumult and disorder that reigned in the camp of the enemy and the atmosphere of reverent devotion that filled the fort. While those in the fort were invoking the name of God and praying for his guidance and mercy, their opponents, officers and men alike, were absorbed in acts of debauchery and shame. Though worn and exhausted, the occupants of the fort continued to observe their vigils and chant such anthems as the Bab had instructed them to repeat. The camp of the enemy at that same hour resounded with peals of noisy laughter, with imprecations and blasphemies. That night in particular, no sooner had the invocation pealed out than the dissolute officers, who were holding their wine glasses in their hands, dropped them instantly to the ground and rushed out headlong in bare feet, as if stunned by that stentorian outcry. Gambling tables were overturned in the midst of the disorder that ensued. Half-dressed and bareheaded, a number ran out into the wilderness, while others betook themselves in haste to the homes of the ulamas and roused them from their sleep. Alarmed and overawed, these began to direct their fiercest invectives against one another for having kindled the fire of such great mischief. As soon as the enemy had discovered the purpose of that loud clamour, they returned to their posts, reassured, though greatly humiliated by their experience. The officers directed a certain number of their men to lie in ambush and to fire in any direction from which those voices might again proceed. Every night they succeeded in this way in slaying a number of the companions. Undeterred by the losses they were repeatedly sustaining, Hujat's supporters continued to raise with undiminished fervour their invocation, despising the perils which the offering of the prayer involved. As their number diminished, the prayer grew louder and acquired added poignancy. Even the imminence of death was powerless to induce the intrepid defenders of the fort to give up what they deemed the noblest and most powerful reminder of their beloved. The contest was still raging when Hujat was moved to address his written message to Nasir-ed-Din Shah. "The subjects of your Imperial Majesty," he wrote him, "regard you both as their temporal ruler and as the supreme custodian of their faith. They appeal to you for justice and look upon you as the supreme protector of their rights. Our controversy primarily concerned the ulamas of Zanjan only, and under no circumstances involved either your government or people. I myself was summoned by your predecessor to Tehran, and was requested by him to set forth the basic claims of my faith. The late Shah was entirely satisfied and highly commended my efforts. I resigned myself to leave my home and settle in Tehran, with no other intention than that of abating the fury that raged round my person, and of extinguishing the fire which the mischief-makers had kindled. Though free to return to my home, I preferred to remain in the capital, wholly relying upon the justice of my sovereign. In the early days of your reign, the Amir Nizam, while the Mazindaran upheaval was still in progress, suspected me of treason and determined to destroy my life. Finding no one in Tehran able to protect me, I determined, in self-defense, to flee to Zanjan, where I resumed my labors and strove with all my might to advance the true interest of Islam. I was pursuing my work when Majd-ud-Dawla arose against me. I several times appealed to him to exercise moderation and justice, but he refused to grant my request. Instigated by the ulamas of Zanjan and encouraged by the adulation they lavished upon him, he determined to arrest me. My friends intervened and attempted to stay his hand. He continued to rouse the people against me, and they, in their turn, have acted in a manner that has led to the present situation. Your Majesty has until now refrained from extending his gracious assistance to us, who are the innocent victims of such ferocious cruelty. Our enemies have even sought to represent our cause, in the eyes of your Majesty, as a conspiracy against the authority with which you have been invested. Surely every unbiased observer will readily admit that we cherish in our hearts no such intention. Our sole aim is to advance the best interests of your government and people. I and my principal companions hold ourselves in readiness to leave for Tehran, that we may, In your presence, as well as in that of our chief opponents, establish the soundness of our cause." Not content with his own petition, he bade his leading supporters address similar appeals to the Shah and stress his request for justice. No sooner had the messenger who was carrying those petitions to Tehran set out on his way than he was seized and brought back into the presence of the governor. Infuriated by the action of his opponents, he ordered the messenger to be immediately put to death. He destroyed the petitions and instead wrote the Shah letters which he loaded with abuse and insult, and adding the signatures of Hujat and his chief companions, dispatched them to Tehran. The Shah was so indignant after the perusal of these insolent petitions that he gave orders for the immediate dispatch of 2 regiments equipped with guns and munitions to Zanjan, commanding that not one supporter of Hujat be allowed to survive. The news of the Bab's martyrdom had meanwhile reached the hard-pressed occupants of the fort through Syed Hassan, brother of Syed Hussein, the Bab's amanuensis, who had arrived from Azerbaijan on his way to Qazvin. The news spread among the enemy, and was welcomed by them with shouts of wild delight. They hastened to ridicule and hurl their taunts at the efforts of his adherents. "For what reason," they cried in haughty scorn, "will you henceforth be willing to sacrifice yourselves? He in whose path you long to lay down your lives has himself fallen a victim to the bullets of a triumphant foe. His body is even now lost both to his enemies and his friends. Why persist in your stubbornness, when a word is sufficient to deliver you from your woes?" However much they strove to shake the confidence of the bereaved community, they failed in the end to induce the feeblest among them either to desert the fort or to recant his faith. The Amir-Nizam was meanwhile urging his sovereign to dispatch further reinforcements to Zanjan. Muhammad Khan, the Amir-Tuman, at the head of 5 regiments and equipped with a considerable amount of arms and munitions, was finally commissioned to demolish the fort and wipe out its occupants. During the 20 days that hostilities were suspended, Aziz Khan-i-Mukri, surnamed Sadar-i-Kul, who was on a military mission to Iravan, arrived at Zanjan and succeeded in meeting Hujat through his host Syed Ali Khan. The latter related to Aziz Khan the circumstances of a touching interview he had had with Hujat, when he had obtained all the information he required regarding the intentions and proposals of the besieged. "Should the government," Hujat had told him, "refuse to entertain my appeal, I am willing, with its permission, to depart with my family to a place beyond the confines of this land. Should it refuse to grant even this request and persist in attacking us, we should feel constrained to arise and defend ourselves." Aziz Khan assured Syed Ali Khan that he would do all in his power to induce the authorities to effect a speedy solution of this problem. No sooner had Syed Ali Khan retired than Aziz Khan was surprised by the Farash of the Amir-Nizam, who had come to arrest Syed Ali Khan and to conduct him to the capital. He was seized with great fear and, in order to avert any suspicion from himself, began to abuse Hujat and to denounce him openly before the Farash. By this means he was able to ward off the danger that threatened his own life. The arrival of the Amir-Tuman was the signal for the resumption of hostilities on a scale such as Zanjan had never before experienced. 17 regiments of cavalry and infantry had rallied to his standard and fought under his command. No less than 14 guns were, at his orders, directed against the fort. 5 additional regiments, which the Emir had recruited from the neighborhood, were being trained by him as reinforcements. The very night he arrived, he issued orders that the trumpets be sounded as a signal for the resumption of the attack. The officers in charge of his artillery were commanded to open fire instantly upon the besieged. The booming of the cannons, which could be heard distinctly at a distance of about 14 farsangs, had scarcely begun when Hujat ordered his companions to make use of the 2 guns they themselves had constructed. One of them was transported to a high position commanding the Amir's headquarters. A ball struck his tent and mortally wounded his steed. The enemy was meanwhile directing with unrelenting fury its fire upon the fort, and had succeeded in killing a large number of its occupants. As the days went by, it became increasingly evident that the forces under the command of the Amir-Tuman, in spite of their great superiority in number, equipment, and training, were unable to achieve the victory they had fondly anticipated. The death of Farrukh Khan, son of Yahya Khan and brother of Haji Suleiman Khan, one of the generals of the enemy's army, aroused the indignation of the Amir Nizam, who addressed a strongly worded communication to the commanding officer, reprimanding him for his failure to force the besieged to an unconditional surrender. "You have sullied the fair name of our country," he wrote him, "have demoralized the army, and have wasted the lives of its ablest officers." He was bidden enforce the strictest discipline among his subordinates, and cleanse his camp from every stain of debauchery and vice. He was, moreover, urged to take counsel with the chiefs of the people of Zanjan, and was warned that, failing to achieve his end, he would be degraded from his position. "If your combined endeavours," he added, "prove powerless to enforce their submission, I myself will proceed to Zanjan, and will order a wholesale massacre of its inhabitants, irrespective of their position or belief. A town that can bring so much humiliation to the Shah and distress to his people is utterly unworthy of the clemency of our sovereign." In a frenzy of despair, the Amir Tuman summoned all the Kharkudas and chiefs of the people, showed them the text of the letter, and by his earnest entreaties succeeded in arousing them to immediate action. The next day every able-bodied man in Zanjan had enlisted under the Amir Tuman's standard. Headed by their Kharkudas and preceded by 4 regiments, a vast multitude of people marched, with the sound of a flourish of trumpets and a beating of drums, in the direction of the fort. Undaunted by their clamour, the companions of Hujat raised simultaneously the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, then poured out of the gates and flung themselves upon them. That encounter was the fiercest and most desperate engagement that had yet been experienced. The flower of Hujat's supporters fell on that day victims to a ruthless carnage. Many a son was butchered in circumstances of unbridled cruelty under the eyes of his mother, while sisters gazed with horror and anguish upon the heads of their brothers raised on spears and brutally disfigured by the weapons of their foes. In the midst of a tumult in which the boisterous enthusiasm of the companions of Hujat faced the fury and barbarism of an exasperated enemy, the voices of women who were struggling side by side with the men could be heard from time to time animating the zeal of their fellow disciples. The victory that was miraculously achieved on that day was, in no small measure, attributable to the shouts of exultation which those women raised in the face of a mighty foe, which acquired added poignancy by their own acts of heroism and self-sacrifice. Disguised in the garb of men, some had rushed forward in their eagerness to supplant their fallen brethren, while the rest were seen carrying on their shoulders skins full of water, with which they strove to allay the thirst and revive the strength of the wounded. Confusion reigned meanwhile in the camp of the enemy. Deprived of water and distressed by defection in their ranks, they fought a losing battle, unable to retreat and impotent to conquer. No less than 300 companions quaffed that day the cup of martyrdom. One of Hujat's supporters was a man named Muhsin, whose function it was to sound the azan. His voice was endowed with a quality of warmth and richness that no man in the neighbourhood could equal. Its reverberation, as he summoned the faithful to prayer, could be distinctly felt as far as the adjoining villages, and penetrated the hearts of those who heard it. Oftentimes did the worshippers in that vicinity, in whose ears the voice of Muhsin was ringing, express their indignation at the charges of heresy imputed to Hujat and his friends. So loud grew their protestations that they eventually reached the ears of the leading Mushtahid of Zanjan, who, unable himself to impose silence upon them, implored the Amir Tuman to devise some means of eradicating from the minds of the people the belief in the piety and uprightness of Hujat and his companions. "Day and night," he complained, "I strive, through my public discourse, no less than by private converse with the people, to instill into their minds the conviction that that wretched band is the sworn enemy of the Prophet and the wrecker of his faith. The cry of that evil man Muhsin robs my words of their influence and nullifies my exertions. To exterminate that miserable wretch is surely your first obligation." The Amir refused at first to entertain his appeal. "You and your like," he replied, "are to be held responsible for having declared the necessity of waging holy war against them. We are but the servants of the government, and our duty is to obey the orders we receive. If you seek, however, to put an end to his life, you should be prepared to make the proper sacrifice." The Seyyid immediately understood the purpose of the Amir's allusion. He had no sooner regained his house than he sent him, by the hand of a messenger, the gift of 100 tumans. The Amir promptly ordered a number of his men, who were famed for their marksmanship, to lie in wait for Muhsin and shoot him when in the act of prayer. It was at the hour of dawn when, as he raised the cry of La ilaha illallah, and a footnote says, "There is no God but God," that a bullet struck him in the mouth and killed him instantly. Hujat, as soon as he was informed of that cruel act, ordered another of his companions to ascend the turret and continue the prayer from where Muhsin had left off. Though his life was spared until the cessation of hostilities, he, together with certain of his brethren, was made to suffer eventually a death no less atrocious than that of his fellow disciple. As the days of the siege were drawing to a close, Hujat urged all those who were betrothed to celebrate their nuptials. For each unmarried youth among the besieged, he chose a spouse, and within the limits of the means at his disposal, contributed from his own purse whatever he could add to the comfort and gladness of the newly married. He sold all the jewels his wife possessed, and with the money provided whatever could be obtained to bring happiness and pleasure to those he had joined in wedlock. During more than 3 months these festivities continued, festivities which were intermingled with the terrors and hardships of a long protracted siege. How often did the clamour of an advancing foe drown the acclamations of joy with which bride and bridegroom greeted each other? How suddenly was the voice of merriment stilled by the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, that summoned the faithful to arise and repulse the invader. With what tenderness would the bride entreat the bridegroom to tarry a while longer beside her ere he rushed forth to win the crown of martyrdom. "I can spare no time," he would reply. "I must hasten to obtain the crown of glory. We shall surely meet again on the shores of the great beyond, the home of a blissful and eternal reunion." No less than 200 youths were joined in wedlock during those tumultuous days. Some a month, others a few days, and still others but a brief moment, were able to tarry undisturbed in the company of their brides. No one among them failed, as the beating of the drum announced the hour of his departure, to respond joyously to the call. Each and every one ungrudgingly offered himself as a sacrifice for his true beloved. All drank eventually the cup of martyrdom. No wonder the spot that has been the theatre of untold sufferings and has witnessed such heroism has been named Ard-i-Allah by the Bab, a title that has remained for all time linked with his own blessed name. And a footnote to Ard-i-Allah, the exalted spot, title given to Zanjan by the Bab. Among the companions was a certain Kabilai Abdul Baqi, the father of 7 sons, 5 of whom Hujat joined in wedlock. The nuptial ceremonies were hardly at an end when cries of terror suddenly announced the resumption of a fresh offensive against them. They sprang to their feet and, forsaking their loved ones, instantly rushed out to repulse the invader. All 5 fell in turn in the course of that encounter. The eldest of them, a youth greatly esteemed for his intelligence and of renowned courage, was captured and conducted into the presence of the Amir Tuman. "Lay him upon the ground," cried the infuriated Amir, "and kindle upon his breast, which dared nourish so great a love for Hujat, a fire that shall consume it." "Wretched man," burst forth the undaunted youth, "no flame that the hands of your men are able to kindle could destroy the love that glows in my heart." The praise of his beloved lingered on his lips until the last moment of his life. Among the women who distinguished themselves by the tenacity of their faith was one named Ashraf, the mother of Ashraf, who was newly married when the storm of Zanjan broke out. She was within the fort when she gave birth to her son, Ashraf. Both mother and child survived the massacre that marked the closing stages of that tragedy. Years afterwards, when her son had grown into a youth of great promise, he was involved in the persecutions that afflicted his brethren. Unable to persuade him to recant, his enemies endeavored to alarm his mother and convince her of the necessity of saving him ere it was too late from his fate. "I will disown you as my son," cried the mother when brought face to face with him, "if you incline your heart to such evil whisperings and allow them to turn you away from the truth." Faithful to his mother's admonitions, Ashraf met his death with intrepid calm. Though herself a witness to the cruelties inflicted on her son, she made no lamentation, neither did she shed a tear. This marvelous mother showed a courage and fortitude that amazed the perpetrators of that shameless deed. I have now in mind, she exclaimed as she cast a parting glance at the corpse of her son, the vow I made on the day of your birth, while besieged in the fort of Ali Mardan Khan. I rejoice that you, the only son whom God gave me, have enabled me to redeem that pledge. My pen is powerless to portray, much less to render befitting tribute to, the consuming enthusiasm that glowed in those valiant hearts. Violent as were the winds of adversity, they were powerless to quench its flame. Men and women labored with unabating fervor to strengthen the defenses of the fort and reconstruct whatever the enemy had demolished. What leisure they could obtain was consecrated to prayer. Every thought, every desire was subordinated to the paramount necessity of guarding their stronghold against the onslaughts of the assailant. The part the women played in these operations was no less arduous than that accomplished by their men companions. Every woman, irrespective of rank and age, joined with energy in the common task. They sewed the garments, baked the bread, ministered to the sick and wounded, repaired the barricades, cleared away from the courts and terraces the balls and missiles fired upon them by the enemy, and last but not least, cheered the faint in heart and animated the faith of the wavering. Even the children joined in giving whatever assistance was in their power to the common cause, and seemed to be fired by an enthusiasm no less remarkable than that which their fathers and mothers displayed. Such was the spirit of solidarity that characterized their labors, and such the heroism of their acts, that the enemy was led to believe their number was no less than 10,000. It was generally conceded that a continual supply of provisions found its way in an unaccountable manner to the fort, and that fresh reinforcements were being steadily dispatched from Neriz, from Khorasan, and from Tabriz. The power of the besieged seemed to them as unshakable as ever, their resources inexhaustible. The Amir Tuman, exasperated by their unyielding tenacity and spurred by the rebukes and protestations of the authorities in Tehran, determined to resort to the abject weapons of treachery in order to exact the complete submission of the besieged. Firmly convinced of the futility of his efforts to face his opponents in the field honorably, he craftily called for the suspension of hostilities and gave currency to the report that the Shah had decided to abandon the whole enterprise. He represented this sovereign as having from the very beginning discountenanced the idea of extending his support to the forces that fought in Mazindaran and Neriz, and of having deplored the shedding of so much blood for so insignificant a cause. The people of Zanjan and the surrounding villages were led to believe that Nasiruddin Shah had actually ordered the Amir Tuman to negotiate a friendly settlement of the issues between him and Hujat, and that it was his intention to put an end as speedily as possible to this unhappy state of affairs. Assured that the people had been deceived by his cunning plot, he drew up an appeal for peace, in which he assured Hujat of the sincerity of his intention of achieving a lasting settlement between him and his supporters. He accompanied that declaration with a sealed copy of the Koran as a testimony of the sacredness of his pledge. My sovereign, he added, has forgiven you. You, as well as your followers, I hereby solemnly declare to be under the protection of his imperial majesty. This book of God is my witness that if any of you decide to come out of the fort, you will be safe from any danger. Hujat reverently received the Koran from the hand of the messenger, and as soon as he had read the appeal, bade its bearer inform his master that he would send an answer in the course of the following day. At night he gathered his chief companions and spoke to them of the misgivings he entertained as to the sincerity of the enemy's declarations. The treacheries of Mazindaran and Neriz are still vivid in our minds. That which was perpetrated against them, the same they purposed to perpetrate against us. In deference to the Koran, however, we shall respond to their invitation, and shall dispatch to their camp a number of our companions, that thereby their deceitfulness may be exposed. I have heard Ustad Mir Ali-i Haddad, who survived the massacre of Zanjan, relate the following. I was one of the 9 children, none of whom were more than 10 years old, who accompanied the delegation sent by Hujat to the Amir Tuman. The rest were men of over 80 years of age. Among them were Kabilai Maula Kuli Akadadash, Darvish Salah, Mohammed Rahim, and Muhammad. Darvish Salah was a most impressive figure, tall of stature, white-bearded, and of singular beauty. He was greatly esteemed for his honourable and just conduct. His intervention on behalf of the downtrodden invariably received the consideration and sympathy of the authorities concerned. He renounced, after his conversion, all the honours he had received, and though far advanced in age, enrolled himself among the defenders of the fort. He marched before us, carrying the sealed Koran, as we were led into the presence of the Amir Tuman. Reaching his tent, we stood at its entrance awaiting his orders. To our salute, he gave no response, and treated us with much contempt. He kept us standing half an hour before he deigned to address us in a tone of severe reprimand. "A meaner and more shameless people than you," he cried in haughty scorn, "has never been seen." He had hurled his denunciations at us when one of the companions, the oldest and feeblest among them, begged to be allowed to say a few words to him, and, on obtaining his permission, spoke, unlettered though he was, in a manner that could not fail to excite our profound admiration. "God knows," he pleaded, "that we were and will ever remain loyal and law-abiding subjects of our sovereign, and with no other desire than to advance the true interest of his government and people. We have been grievously misrepresented by our ill-wishers. No one of the Shah's representatives was inclined to protect or befriend us. No one was found to plead our cause before us. We repeatedly appealed to him, but he ignored our entreaty and was deaf to our call. Our enemies, emboldened by the indifference which characterized the attitude of the ruling authorities, assailed us from every side, plundered our property, violated the honor of our wives and daughters, and captured our children. Undefended by our government and encompassed by our foes, we felt constrained to arise and defend our lives." The Amir Tuman turned to his lieutenant and asked him what action he would advise him to take. "I am at a loss," the Amir added, "as to the answer I should give this man. Were I at heart religious, I would unhesitatingly embrace his cause." "Nothing but the sword," replied his lieutenant, "will deliver us from the abomination of heresy." "I still hold the Koran in my hand," interposed Darvish Salah, "and carry the declaration which you of your own accord chose to make. Are the words we have just heard our reward for having responded to your appeal?" The Amir Tuman, in a burst of fury, ordered that Darvish Salah's beard be torn out, and that he, with those who were with him, be thrown into a dungeon. I and the rest of the children were scared and attempted to escape. Raising the cry of "Ya Sahibu Saman," we hurried in the direction of our barricades. Some of us were overtaken and made prisoners. As I was fleeing, the man who was pursuing me laid hold upon the hem of my garment. I tore myself away from him and managed to reach the gate that led to the approaches of the fort in a state of utter exhaustion. How great was my surprise when I saw one of the companions, a man named Imam Kuli, being savagely mutilated by the enemy. I was horrified as I gazed upon that scene, knowing as I did that on that very day the cessation of hostilities had been proclaimed and the most solemn pledges given that no acts of violence would be committed. I was soon informed that the victim had been betrayed by his brother, who, on the pretext of desiring to speak with him, had handed him over to his persecutors. I straightway hastened to Hujat, who lovingly received me, and wiping the dust from my face and clothing me with new garments, invited me to be seated by his side and bade me to tell him the fate of his companions. I described to him all that I had seen. "It is the tumult of the day of resurrection," he explained, "a tumult such as the world has never seen before. This is the day on which man shall fly from his brother and his mother and his father and his wife and his children." Quote from the Quran 80:34. This is the day when man, not content with having abandoned his brother, sacrifices his substance in order to shed the blood of his nearest kinsman. This is the day when every suckling woman shall forsake her suckling babe, and every woman that hath a burden in her womb shall cast her burden. And thou shalt see men drunken, yet are they not drunken, but it is the mighty chastisement of God. Quote from the Quran 22:2. Seating himself in the center of the Maidan, Hujat summoned his followers. On their arrival he arose, and standing erect in their midst, spoke to them these words: "I am well pleased with your unflinching endeavors, my beloved companions. Our enemies are bent upon our destruction. They harbor no other desire. Their intention was to trick you into coming out of the fort, and then to slaughter you mercilessly after their heart's desire. Finding that their treachery has been exposed, they have, in the fury of their rage, ill-treated and imprisoned the oldest and the youngest among you. It is clear that not until they capture this fort and scatter you for they laid down their arms and ceased their persecutions against us. Your continued presence in this fort will eventually cause you to be taken captive by the enemy, who will of a certainty dishonor your wives and slay your children. Better is it, therefore, for you to make your escape in the middle of the night, and to take your wives and children with you. Let each one seek a place of safety until such time as this tyranny shall be overpast. I shall remain alone to face the enemy. It were better that my death should allay their thirst for revenge, than that you should all perish." The companions were moved to their very depths, and with tears in their eyes declared their firm resolve to remain to the end by his side. "We can never consent," they exclaimed, "to abandon you to the mercy of a murderous enemy. Our lives are not more precious than your life, neither are our families of a more noble descent than that of your kinsmen. Whatever calamity may befall you, it is what we shall welcome for ourselves." All except a few remained true to their pledge, these unable to bear the ever-increasing distress of a prolonged siege, and encouraged by the advice of Hujat himself, had given them, betook themselves to a place of safety outside the fort, thus separating themselves from the rest of their fellow disciples. Nerved to a resolve of despair, the Amir Tuman ordered all able-bodied men in Zanjan to assemble in the neighborhood of his camp, ready to receive his commands. He reorganized the forces of his regiments, appointed their officers, and added them to the host of fresh recruits that had massed in the town. He ordered no less than 16 regiments, each equipped with 10 guns, to march against the fort. 8 of these regiments were charged to attack the fort every forenoon, after which the remainder of the forces were to replace them in their offensive until the approach of evening. The Amir himself took the field, and was seen in the forenoon of every day directing the efforts of his hosts, assuring them of the reward awaiting their success, and warning them of the punishment which, in the event of defeat, the sovereign would inflict upon them. For 1 whole month the siege continued. Not content with attacks by day, the enemy several times attacked them by night also. The fierceness of their onslaughts, the overwhelming force of their numbers, and the rapid succession of the onsets thinned the ranks of the companions and aggravated their distress. Reinforcements for the enemy continued to pour in from all directions, while the besieged languished in a state of misery and hunger. The Amir Nizam, meanwhile, decided to strengthen the hands of the Amir Tuman by the appointment of Hassan Ali Khan-i Karusi, who was commanded to march at the head of 2 Sunni regiments to Zanjan. His arrival was the signal for the concentration of the enemy's artillery on the fort. A tremendous bombardment threatened the structure with immediate destruction. It lasted for a number of days, during which the stronghold stood firm in spite of the increasing fire which was directed against it. The friends of Hujat displayed during those days a valor and skill that even their bitterest foes were compelled to admire. One day, while the bombardment was still in progress, a bullet struck Hujat in the right arm as he was performing his ablutions. Though he ordered his servant not to inform his wife of the wound he had received, yet such was the man's grief that he was powerless to conceal his emotion. His tears betrayed his distress, and no sooner had the wife of Hujat learned of the injury inflicted on her husband than she ran in distress and found him absorbed in prayer in a state of unruffled calm. Though bleeding profusely from his wound, his face retained its expression of undisturbed confidence. "Pardon this people, O God," he was heard to say, "for they know not what they do. Have mercy upon them, for they who have led them astray are alone responsible for the misdeeds the hands of this people have wrought." Hujat sought to calm the agitation that his wife and relatives at the sight of the blood that covered his body. "Rejoice," he told them, "for I am still with you, and desire you to be wholly resigned to God's will. What you now behold is but a drop compared to the ocean of afflictions that will be poured forth at the hour of my death. Whatever be his decree, it is our duty to acquiesce and bow down to his will." No sooner had the news that he had been wounded reached the companions than they laid down their arms and hastened to him. The enemy, meanwhile, taking advantage of the momentary absence of their adversaries, redoubled their attack upon the fort and were able to force their passage through its gate. That day they took captive no less than 100 of the women and children and plundered all their possessions. Despite the severity of that winter, These captives were left exposed in the open for no less than 15 days and nights to a biting cold such as Zanjan had rarely experienced. Clad in the thinnest of garments, with no covering to protect them, they were abandoned without food and shelter in the wilderness. Their only protection was the gauze that covered their heads, with which they sought in vain to shield their faces from the icy wind that blew mercilessly upon them. Crowds of women, most of whom were inferior to them in social position, flocked from the various quarters of Zanjan to the scene of their sufferings, and poured upon them contempt and ridicule. "You have now found your God," they scornfully exclaimed as they danced wildly around them, "and have been rewarded abundantly by him." They spat in their faces and heaped upon them the foulest invectives. The capture of the fort, their robbing Hujat's companions of their chief instrument of defence, failed either to daunt their spirit or discourage their efforts. All property on which the enemy could lay its hands was plundered, and the women and children who were left defenceless were made captives. The rest of the companions, together with the remaining women and children, crowded into the houses that lay in the close vicinity of Hujat's residence. They were divided into 5 companies, each consisting of 19 times 19 companions. From each of these companies 19 would rush forth together, and, raising with one voice the cry of "Ya Sahibuz Saman," would fling themselves into the midst of the enemy, and would succeed in scattering its forces. The uplifted voices of these 95 companions would alone prove sufficient to paralyze the efforts and crush the spirit of their assailants. This state of affairs continued for a few days, bringing in its wake both humiliation and loss to an enemy that had believed itself capable of achieving immediate and signal victory. Many were killed in the course of these encounters. Officers, to the distress of their superiors, were beginning to desert their posts. The captains of the artillery were abandoning their guns, whilst the rank and file of the army was demoralized and completely exhausted. The Amir Tuman was himself weary of the coercive measures to which he had been compelled to resort in order to maintain the discipline of his men and to keep unimpaired their efficiency and vigor. He was driven again to take counsel with the remainder of his officers, and to seek a desperate remedy for a situation that was fraught with grave danger to his own life, no less than to that of the inhabitants of Zanjan. "I am weary," he confessed, "of the grim resistance of this people. They are evidently animated by a spirit which no amount of encouragement from our sovereign can hope to call forth in our own men. Such self-renunciation surely no one in the ranks of our army is able to manifest. No power that I can command is able to arouse my men from the slough of despair into which they have fallen. Whether they triumph or fail, these soldiers believe themselves doomed to eternal damnation." Their mature deliberations resulted in the decision to dig out underground passages from their site, which their camp occupied, to a place underneath the quarter in which the dwellings of Hujat's adherents were situated. They determined to blow up these houses, and by this means to force them to an unconditional surrender. For 1 whole month they labored to fill these underground passages with all manner of explosives, and continued at the same time to demolish with fiendish cruelty such houses as remained standing. Wishing to accelerate the work of destruction, the Amir Tuman ordered the officers in charge of his artillery to direct their fire upon Hujat's residence, as the buildings that intervened between that house and the camp of the enemy had been razed to the ground, there remaining no further obstacle in the way of its ultimate destruction. A section of his dwelling had already collapsed when Hujat, who was still living within its walls, turned to his wife Khadiji, who was holding Hadi, their baby, in their arms, and warned her that the day was fast approaching when she and her infant might be taken captive, and bade her be prepared for that day. She was giving vent to her distress when a cannonball struck the room which she occupied and killed her instantly. Her child, whom she was holding to her breast, fell into the brazier beside her, and shortly afterwards died of the injuries he had received in the house of Mirza Abul Qasim, the Mujtahid of Zanjan. Hujat, though filled with grief, refused to yield to idle sorrow. "The day whereon I found thy beloved one, O my God," he cried, "and recognized in him the manifestation of thy eternal spirit, I foresaw the woes that I should suffer for thee. Great as have been until now my sorrows, they can never compare with the agonies that I would willingly suffer in thy name. How can this miserable life of mine, the loss of my wife and of my child, and the sacrifice of the band of my kindred and companions compare with the blessings which the recognition of thy manifestation has bestowed on me? Would that a myriad lives were mine. Would that I possessed the riches of the whole earth and its glory, that I might resign them all freely and joyously in thy path. The tragic loss their beloved leader had sustained, and the grievous wound inflicted upon him, distressed the companions of Hujat, and filled them with burning indignation. They determined to make a last and desperate effort to avenge the blood of their slaughtered brethren. Hujat, however, dissuaded them from making that attempt, and exhorted them not to hasten the issue of the conflict. He bade them resign themselves to the will of God, and to remain calm and steadfast to the end, whenever that end might come. As time went on, their number diminished, their sufferings multiplied, and the area within which they could feel secure was reduced. On the morning of the 5th of the month of Rabi'ul Awwal in the year A.H. 1267, the 8th of January, A.D. 1851, Hujat, who had already for 19 days endured the severe pain caused by his wound, was in the act of prayer and had fallen prostrate upon his face, invoking the name of the Bab, when suddenly he passed away. His sudden death came as a severe shock to his kindred and companions. Their grief at the passing of so able, so accomplished, and so inspiring a leader was profound. The loss was irreparable. Two of his companions, Tin Muhammad Wazir and Mir Rizai-i Sardar, straightway undertook, ere the enemy was made aware of his death, to inter his remains in a place which neither his kindred nor his friends could suspect. At midnight the body was borne to a room that belonged to Din Muhammad Wazir, where it received burial. They demolished that room in order to ensure the safety of the remains from destruction, and exercised the utmost care to maintain the secrecy of that spot. More than 500 women who survived that terrible tragedy were, immediately after the death of Hujat, gathered together in his house. His companions, in spite of the death of their leader, continued to face with undiminished zeal the forces of their assailants. Of the great multitude that had flocked to the standard of Hujat, there remained only 200 vigorous men. The rest either had died or were utterly incapacitated by the wounds they had received. The knowledge of the removal of so inspiring a leader nerved the enemy to resistance, and decided them to wipe out what still remained of the formidable forces they had been unable to subdue. They launched a general attack, fiercer and more determined than any previous one. Animated by the beating of drums and the sounding of trumpets, and encouraged by the shouts of exultation raised by the populace, they threw themselves upon the companions with unbridled ferocity, resolved not to rest until the whole company had been annihilated. In the face of this fierce onset, the companions raised once more the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, and rushed forth undismayed to continue the heroic struggle until all of them had been either slain or captured. That massacre had scarcely been perpetrated when the signal was given for a pillage unexampled in its scope and ferocity. Had not the Amir Tuman issued orders to spare what remained of the house and belongings of Hujat, and to refrain from any acts of violence against his kindred, even more dastardly attacks would have been made by his rapacious army. His intention was to inform the authorities in Tehran and to seek from them whatever advice they wished to give him. He failed, however, to restrain indefinitely the spirit of violence which animated his men. The ulamas of Zanjan, flushed with the victory that had cost them such exertion and loss of life, and which had involved to such an unprecedented degree their reputation and prestige, endeavored to incite the populace to commit every imaginable outrage against the lives of their men captives and the honor of their women. The sentinels who guarded the entrance to the house in which Hujat had been living were driven from their posts in the general tumult that ensued. The populace joined hands with the army to plunder the property and assail the persons of the few who still survived that memorable struggle. Neither the Amir Tuman nor the governor was able to allay the thirst for plunder and revenge which had seized the whole town. Order and discipline no longer existed in the midst of the general confusion.